Afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, also WFOB 92.1. And I want to commend again those over there at that particular studio, Mr. Paul Herring, and also the Odyssey House that are doing a fine job of bringing excellent programming over that network. I want to thank you, Paul. Keep doing the fine job you're doing on behalf of the community, because your services are very much needed, and you are doing such a great job. Want to make sure that you understand we are commending you for what you're doing. Keep up the good work. We're trying to do our part over here at allpointstv.com. So we are taking some inspiration from your efforts, and we are trying to bring up the rear, so to speak. And we hope we are, in fact, complementing the things that are being done otherwise. We are going to be covering 3 topics today in our 4-part series we were doing, have been doing for the last 3 weeks. We didn't get a chance to finish all of the narratives that we had planned, but we hope to be able to catch up today in this program. We were supposed to have been doing the thing on the Kennedy assassination. I was saying that the Kennedy assassination is implied in terms of having to reopen that case based upon what's happening right now with the Donald Trump scenario, where they were trying, the intelligence community was trying to topple a duly held election in this country. They tried, but they failed. But it does raise the question of, if they would be so brazen in doing that in this case, then what have they done in the past to bring about similar results? And I can see them working from behind the scenes in terms of the overthrow of the Nixon administration, which was, in fact, there was a coup d'etat in this country in 1974 when Richard Nixon was forced to resign. And then before that, you saw that similarly situated in terms of the luring of John F. Kennedy into Texas, and which was a place where the vice president was from, and lured him into Texas. He never got out of there alive. And the person that succeeded him, Lyndon Johnson, was the person that benefited from the assassination. We didn't raise the question then, but now we have a much more authentic view of how the intelligence community operates. So we now can go back and say, well, this fits into a pattern that we had not looked at in 1963 when the assassination took place. So we're going to try to pick up at that point, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to also talk about the usurpation of Barack Obama. And I want you to know I'm not a fan, and you'll have that. I want you to be aware of that from the outset. I am not a fan of Barack Obama, who I consider to be a usurper, but not in the sense that he is not born in the United States. Another topic we're going to cover also is the duping of the NAACP in the Brown versus Board of Education case that was rendered by the Supreme Court on May the 17th, 1954. And I want to try to bring some different understandings of that particular court case that, as you know, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, that had been ruled upon by the Supreme Court in 1896, when the court had said that Plessy versus Ferguson, you could in fact have separate facilities as long as those separate facilities were in fact equal under provisions found in the 14th Amendment. So I want to bring that into a public view and try some other understandings of how that particular court ruling was in fact rendered and what that was about. Lastly, I want to talk about something that hopefully will awaken some of the people in the black community about this whole mythology of black leadership. And I understand the need for an awakening because I went through that process myself when I had a conversation with the great James Bowen, who treated me like I was a child. It was just like yesterday, but it happened in the 70s. And I remember so clearly asking James Baldwin what he thought about black leadership, and James Baldwin chastised me like I was some kind of a teenager. And I'll talk about that at the end of the program today. But those topics, the usurpation of Barack Obama, the duping of the NAACP in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, and then the mythology of black leadership. I want to try to cover those topics today in our in what is really the 4th part of our series, but I'll go back and touch on some of the topics that we should have finished in past programs. We didn't get around to all of it, so I'll try to bring it all together in our concluding part of the series. We'll be back on task next week, which is the second week in September, and we will at that point be back where we should be as far as now catching up and doing our programs live. These programs are being broadcast from a certain canning of programs we've done here at the studio in preparation for the time that I'll be out of the country, and we didn't want to have anything stop while I'm gone. So these programs have been pre-taped, but we hope they are still current in terms of what is happening right now in the American mythos. Let's start off talking about the usurpation of Barack Obama. Most people think that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and therefore not eligible to be president because the Constitution in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 says, only natural-born citizens shall be eligible to the presidency, or those who are citizens at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. That is, say that in order to be a president, you must be naturally born, but there's a caveat right next to it that's been missed by the scholars that claim that the Constitution does not define natural-born citizens. And this shows me there's a literacy problem in this country because it is defined in the Constitution if you know how to read it. It says that you have to be a natural-born citizen. The exception is those that are citizens at the time of the document being ratified. So if you are a citizen at the time of the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, then you are given an exception to the natural birth requirement of the Constitution. And then in addition to that requirement of being natural born, there's also you must have reached the age of 35 years of age, and you must have resided in the United States for a period of 14 years. The persons that were made citizens because of their being citizens at the time of the ratification of the document, they are exempt from all of that language. Now, the question that I want to make sure we all understand before I get to this usurpation of this 44th president, I want to make it clear of why that language is in there in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. Why does it, in fact, make an exemption in terms of the natural birth citizenship? Because it says only natural-born citizens only natural-born citizens or citizens at the time of the ratification of the Constitution shall be eligible for the presidency, and also none should be eligible for the president not obtained for the age of 35 and been a resident inside the country for 14 years. Why is that exemption given in terms of natural-born citizenship? The reason for that is because if you have the requirement for natural-born citizen and the ratification of the Constitution takes place in 1788, drawn up in 1787, it means that at that point, given the fact that the U.S. is created in 1776, there are no persons of age at that point that meets that requirement. So therefore, it makes an exception to the natural birth citizenship by saying then, if they are citizens at the time of the ratification, they don't have to then be held to account under the provisions in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. And that's why it is there. And you scholars that are saying that natural-born citizenship is not defined in the Constitution, go back and read it again more carefully and see it is in there if you know how to read it. But that's a problem we have in this country. I'm telling you, we got a problem in this country with people that are not we do not have a high level of literacy in the United States, and we haven't had it for a long period of time. But if you can read it, you understand that you have to be a natural-born citizen. However, there is a caveat right next to it, and the caveat is if you were a citizen when the Constitution was in fact drafted and then ratified. Drafted in 1787, ratified in 1788. If you are a citizen at that time, then that language then is not applicable to those persons who are given an exemption. And that's why that caveat is put right next to the requirement of being a natural born citizen, because none of the persons that were been of age at that point would have been eligible to be run for president by the fact that you're a natural born citizen, because there would have been no natural born citizens because the country was only born in 1776. So just subtract 1788 minus 1776 and you get 12 years. The nation is only 12 years old, but is requiring citizenship at the age of 35, and no one would have met that requirement, and no one would have the requirement of being in the United States for a period of 14 years, because the country is only 12 years old at this point. From 1776 to 1788 is a period of 12 years. They would have been excluded on all three levels of what's required to be president of the United States, and that's why that exception is there. Do you understand that, Alan Dershowitz? and Lawrence Tribe at Harvard University? Do you understand that? Because Moss is trying to teach you something here. What Steve is trying to tell you is that you guys basically on a different frequency of illiteracy, because you don't think that the Constitution defines natural born citizenship. And I'm showing you it does define it. You have to be born today, you have to be born inside of the United States. And you don't understand that. That's why you allowed the real usurper in that regard to run in 2008. Because John McCain wasn't eligible to run for president of the United States. You can't tell me, based upon what's written in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, that the eligibility was John McCain when John McCain was born in the Panama Canal. Now, the Panama Canal, the last time I looked, I think what we have right now, correct me if I'm wrong, as of 1959, you had Alaska was the 49th state, and Hawaii was the 50th state. So we all agree, do we not? We got 50 states. Has anybody heard of the Panama Canal being annexed as the 51st state? Or Puerto Rico annexed as a 52nd state? Has anybody heard of that? No. You have to be born in the United States. Don't come telling me you put a flag down in the Panama Canal, and therefore, because the flag has been raised, you're not eligible to run for president, because that's extra constitutional. And so I want to make it clear here that this usurpation, Barack Obama is not that. Barack Obama was born in the United States. He was born in Hawaii. His usurpation is a little bit different than that. And I fought so-called black leaders for not standing up for the black constituency in this country. They don't represent the black constituency in this country, and they do not represent their interests. If they did, a lot of things they're doing they would not be doing. They would not, for example, be accepting this immigration. They'd be the first one speaking out against it because of the competition that these low-skilled workers are bringing into the country, competing with black workers who are at the lower ends of the economic and political scale, and bring those low-interest workers into the country who are working at a lower rate. They are competing with blacks and so on and so forth. And here are these so-called black leaders in the Congressional Black Caucasian Caucus that are supporting this illegal immigration, which hurts blacks when they come in and compete for that. So that's a problem. And I also fault them for not pointing out there's a problem for Barack Obama to take a bow and act like he was part of the history in terms of blacks running for president in the United States. Because if Obama is born in the United States, and I say that he was, you just can't go back and change those records like that. He was born in 1961. Those records are very clear that Barack Obama was born in a hospital in Hawaii. That's not a usurpation. The reason why people think he was born outside the country is because Obama is an opportunist. When it behooved him to claim he was a foreign-born student in order to get foreign loan money, in order to go to school, Barack Obama did that. And when it behooved him to claim that he was born in the country, now that he wants to run for president, he also did that. But for 7 years, Barack Obama was saying that he was born, that he was a foreign student. That's because he was getting foreign aid. The man is an opportunist. And he's an opportunist when he stands on the schoolhouse steps at the State House on February the 10th, 2007, and announced his bid to become the 44th president of the United States. That's a usurpation. Because if you know that Barack Obama's father was Kenyan, we all agree on that. No one disagrees that Barack Obama's father was never a citizen of the United States. We all agree that he was never a citizen. Therefore, you cannot pass down to your son through the father a citizenship and make him a natural born citizen because the father was never a citizen. So that's impossible. If that is true, then the citizenship that is in place for Barack Obama is a citizenship through his mother, who is from Kansas. And if his mother is a citizen of the United States to which Barack Obama gets his citizenship, then that cannot be anything related to the cotton field unless you're saying that Barack Obama's mother was passing as Rachel Dolezal was passing, as she says she was passing, as they say she was passing, as a black person who comes out of a white family. If you're not convinced the mother was in fact passing as a white person but had black lineage to the cotton field, then Barack Obama is a usurper of not the citizenship of the country. He's a usurper of black people's history in this country. And I'm making that assertion, and I want anyone out there in the scholarly world to prove what I'm saying to be untrue. The usurpation of Barack Obama was that he took the citizenship of blacks and ran with it as if that citizenship was tied into the citizenship of those whose ancestral roots go back to those cotton fields. And Barack Obama's ancestral claims do not go back to those cotton fields. His ancestral claims, based on his father, go back to whatever was going on in Kenya. And if you doubt that, you go to Kenya and try to claim some ascendancy from the Kenyan standpoint, and you're born here in the United States. Try that. Go over there, where I'll be next week, as a matter of fact. Go over there and try to claim, just even try to claim that you are an African American. Just use that language over there and see what happens. They're not going to buy it because they know that's not true. Black people over here saying they're African American. They're not buying that in Africa. And you've been over here since 1619. None of you came across any boat in your lifetime and became a citizen of the United States. You're not an African American. You are an American. You're a black American. If you go in Africa right now and say you're an African American, every country I've been in, 17 altogether, of the 55 countries that are in Africa at the present time, because Sudan became two countries, North Sudan and South Sudan, so now we have 55 countries in Africa. You go in any parts of the African continent and then say African American, see if any of them buy it. It's not bought anywhere on the continent. I've actually gone into African countries to ask that question. What do you think when you hear the term African American? They do not accept it. So go to Kenya and try to claim that you're a part of that history in Kenya. And they're going to ask you what they asked me when I was trying to make the claim back there in the 80s, when I began to understand this better. What they asked me when I said African, they said, what tribe? They said, what language? What ethnic group? What country? And when I didn't have any answers, I began to recognize what they were saying, reinforced by a book that Clarence Walker wrote, very important book, titled, "We Can Never Go Home Again, because you are this and you're not that."
You know, my mother is Hungarian, Hungarian extraction. And she met up with people, they came over, her family came over in the, like maybe 1890s, 1900s. And she met up with the people that came over in 1956, fleeing the Soviets during the revolution, what they call the Hungarian Revolution. And they were vastly different between that span of time. Just totally different, and they're just like kind of, there was odds with each other. They had odds with each other largely because the new arrivals had expectations of basically a lot of them did that they thought the more established people here should take care of them as they came to this country and stuff. And they said, "Look, you're on your own." I mean, that was we came over so many years ago, but they were pretty much acclimated. But there's just a division with that span of time. When you talk about not even having any connection or way of truly ascertain your identity. Regards it goes to tribal relationship or language or whatever. There's that's even a further gulf between those people and the people in Africa and the people here.
Yes, John. See, you understand the disconnect, but it's very hard for people who have not been to Africa to understand how much of a disconnection they have, even in the claims that they're making. Because Africa is not a country; Africa is a continent. And when you understand that there are 54 countries in that, 55 countries in Africa, and that inside of the countries themselves, there's a lot of indigenous cultures that are different from each other inside of even each of the countries.
Well, another thing is too, watching TV sitcoms growing up, they talk about blacks always had interest in Swahili. Well, that's a small group of people in comparison to all the other language
and
groups.
In East Africa, by the way. You could go into Somalia, where Swahili, which is a combination of the Arab language and African language, some African language, and they are intertwined to create Kiswahili. But only in the eastern part of Africa, and it's only in one of the parliaments in Africa. They do not have Swahili in any other parliament except in Somalia. And you can go into a lot of those African countries, and you're going to be very much amazed at the fact that in every other parliament in Africa, the colonial language is spoken. I'll be taking some people of our study group over to Africa next week.
Like in India, I mean, as much as the English were bad to the people of India, they use that language, the English language, as pretty much the common denominating language now, because there's so many dialects. I mean, people from different regions and different provinces, whatever they call it. I mean, or states. They call them states there. They don't recognize each other's language.
No, they don't, John. You do. The reason why you use the colonial languages there, also in Africa, is because if you use any of the indigenous languages, then the language that is not being used of an indigenous group, then they are jealous of the fact that using that ethnic group's language, not their own, and they see it for what it is. They see it as cultural imperialism. You are, in fact, using another culture, and you are imposing that culture on a group that's not that group. So, as I said in the previous conversation that we had, when I was in South Africa 2 years ago, and I was reading, while I was there, I was reading the South African Constitution. That Mandela, that had gotten out of, Mandela had been in prison for 27 years. And when he got out in 1991, I said last time it was 1994, he actually got out of prison in 1991, but 3 years later they made him president of the country. And Mandela began to want to write a multicultural constitution, which he did that in 1996. But in writing a multicultural constitution, he then had to recognize all of the indigenous groups that were inside of South Africa in order to bring them together in a certain amount of harmony with each other. And the only way you can do that is have written in the Constitution that each of the indigenous groups' language would be recognized as official languages of South Africa. That's how he did it. But if you go in South Africa, they're using the English language or they are using Dutch. because to use any other language would create friction. So in all the other countries in Africa right now, with the exception of Somalia, they're using the colonial languages in Africa for the reason they do not want to have the disconnect. And I want people to be aware of that because they're telling us that diversity is our strength. Diversity is not our strength. Our strength is our unity in this country and every other country around the world. If you have diversity and you don't have unity, you have a country that's being torn apart by its diversity. You can make all the claims you want to, but there's no proof anywhere on the planet that countries are in fact enriched by diversity within their boundary lines, because that creates a friction inside of these countries. And Africa is a good example of that because in Africa, the lines that were drawn around these different indigenous groups were not drawn by Africans, they were drawn by Europe at the conference called the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. But there's a lot of diversity inside of Africa, but the way those lines are drawn, they drew those lines around those diverse groups and made them into a nation state, and a lot of friction they have in Africa right now is because of that.
Well, look at Winston Churchill when he came back from one conference to talk about the Middle East. He quipped, with the slip of a pen, I created Transjordan or something like that. I mean, he made a joke about how they just arbitrarily came. And the thing is, now these people come like really attached to those boundaries created by outsiders.
Yeah, you got to understand that is a tremendous problem. And when you over here, I can see how we got confused because you're looking back at the continent, and all you see is the color of the people on the continent. You don't see the diversity inside the continent because you're looking through the landscape of the West, which is, of course, looking at it from a color standpoint. I understand the confusion because I was into it as of 1984 when I went to Egypt. And I went there thinking that the prism in which I was looking at the African continent was the way they saw it on the continent itself. And I got over and got my feelings hurt. And they showed me there that there was a distinction to be made based upon them and myself, and that we were not the same. I actually said to the person, we are the same. And the guy told me we're not the same. And he showed me some ways in which he saw it, very different the way I saw it. I came away kind of, understanding, hey, it's a whole different identity. It's another way of looking at identity in the world, not the way it's looked at necessarily in the United States. I got ideologically baptized that day. And now I began to see it through a different and wider lens, which is how I see it now, because that's what I found wherever I've been, and they're gonna be surprised when I take them over there, because there are 4 people going over there, and when they get there, they're gonna be surprised because they're part of my study group. But they all see it through this lens of they're one people. They're not one people. There are 2,000 languages in Africa. Probably 1,000 different ethnic groups. And many of them are multilingual, but they have their own. I know some people that speak 5 languages, never went to school in Africa. But even though they may speak Mandingo, they might speak Wolof, they would be Jola. Jola being the 3rd largest group in the place where we'll be. I'll be over there visiting where Alex here claims that he came from. So I want to take him there to let them see that. But I want to understand the point I'm making here, that to usurp, you cannot be more disrespectful than to usurp the identity of a group, which is what Barack Obama did. The only equivalent I can see close to it is what was done by Pocahontas, Elizabeth Warren, who appropriated the identity of Native Americans. And I'm going to tell you something. Although Barack Obama was credited with this appropriation by blacks and made him president, black people voted for him 95%. We should learn a lesson from that and punish anyone who would do something like that, okay? Because identity is a very serious thing, because that's where a people house all of their psychological, they put all of their psychological baggage within the construct of their identity. And anyone that attacks that is attacking the very personality of that group. Elizabeth Warren did it. We can now see that in terms of her coming out and apologizing for it. So Barack Obama, where's your apology? Because you did the same thing.
Wasn't Barack Obama's family in Africa actually probably likely some of the families connected to slavery?
No question about it, because because that's where the slave trade was not what Alice Hedges said it was. Slave trade is different African groups, different groups in Africa that are capturing other groups in Africa based upon which group had the power at different points in time, and they are in fact, they got a choice here: to kill the captives or to take them prisoner and then to sell them to make a profit from it. This idea that the Europeans went into Africa and grabbed black people out of the continent and put them on those boats and all, that's the Western idea of it. That's not what happened. Anybody that knows the real history knows that slave trade is exactly what Basil Davidson calls it in his book called The African Slave Trade. This is an African slave trade. If that had not happened in terms of the so-called Africans, that's another problem, because to say that there is an Africa, which means that you're a continental group, that is born out of the colonial period, because there are no people walking around in Africa before the colonization of Africa calling themselves Africans. They were calling themselves by their indigenous groups. That's what Alan Missouri is talking about on page 98 of his book called The Africans. Go read his book, called The Africans. And look on page 98, which is chapter 4 of that book. And if it's not there, come back and tell me that I was wrong. Mr. Miles, you said it was on page 98. You said it was chapter 4. I looked on the page. It wasn't there. It is there. I'm right and they're wrong. You can go, so this, to usurp a group's identity is unconscionable and unforgivable. But here these people are applauding this man. Are they applauding, did the Cherokee applaud Pocahontas, who had 1,024, that's like a teeny, as we say in my neighborhood, a teeny weensy part of her bloodline, way back, bled out of her and basically bred out of her family over a period of time, and she's claiming that she has ancestral claims on that culture. That's an appropriation that is unforgivable. I would never vote for Elizabeth Warren, because I take appropriation of identity very seriously, and I don't think you'll have her. Let's find out what happens in 2020. I don't think there'll be a single Cherokee that'll vote for a person that would do something like that. And here are blacks voting 95% for this man that did the same thing to them this woman did to the Cherokees. It's unconscionable and it's unforgivable that you do something like that. And if you're still applauding this man because they still have not awakened to how Obama misappropriated that history. That man jumped in front of the change in the racial landscape of America, jumped in front of it, and then claimed he was a part of that history. How are you part of that history and your ancestral claims in Kenya? If you are talking about your black roots. Your black roots are not in those cotton fields. Your black roots are in Kenya. Your other roots are in America. Your citizenship come through the other part of your family tree. So how are you in that? How are you standing there on the State House steps in Springfield, Illinois, standing up there as if the Emancipation Proclamation was in fact issued by Abraham Lincoln, January 1st, 1863. It has something to do with your family. Give me a break. And I'm very proud that in 2012, and I'll say this very loudly, and I do it without apology, I voted against Barack Obama. And he ran again, can run for a third term, shouldn't have had the second term. Really, he shouldn't have had the first term. be honest, because if you're going to finally credit those that bled and toiled in this country, they say 400 years, from 1619 to the time that slavery was ended, and then beyond that point, Jim Crow and those things. And then you have a person standing up in their place, taking the credit for that toil and that burden, and then running in their name for president, and they applaud him. People got to be confused to do something like that. And Barack Obama did something that was just as bad as what they're doing over in these countries where there's cultural appropriation in those countries. It's unforgivable. You go over there, African, and start saying you African and see what you get. They look at that as a cultural imposition. And I've asked them, are you considering persons in America as African Americans? And each one I've asked in 17 different countries have all answered the same. No, you're not African, you're Black American. They told Gates that from Harvard University. They did this called Wonders of the African World, the 6-part series he did in 2000. They told Gates that you are a Black American. And when I go over there next, I'll be arriving there next Monday on the 18th. Make sure I got the date right. We're leaving out on the 18th. We'll arrive in West Africa on the 19th, that Monday. And on that date, they'll get off the plane and they will be in Banjul, and they will be among the people that are Mandingo, that are Jola. Some of them are Wolof, the main groups, and other small groups. And they will not be a part of either one of them. I found that out when I was made an Igbo chief in 2009. I went through the rituals to become an Igbo chief. I'm an Igbo chief. But when I went through the rituals of what it took to become a chief, every part of that ritual had to be explained. And even at the end of it, I had to go back and understand it, because there were some things that I was introduced into that were strange to me. It would not have been strange if they would introduce me into the Constitution of the United States, and I had been, there was some ritual around the Declaration of Independence. I would have known all of that, all the laws of the country and things like that. I was very familiar with that, with the American side. But in terms of the African side of it, that was all new to me. And anyone that had gone through that, because another person went through it with me from America, they would have had the same experience I had in terms of having to understand it from their reference point. Because things, as Chinny Achebe said, things do fall apart. I am not interested in anyone that would usurpate the identity of any group. And if I'm down on Elizabeth Warren for having done it, and she did have the good sense, and I won't say integrity, because she should have done it in the first place, but at least she did apologize. I am demanding that a Barack Obama stand up, which had never happened, but stand up in front of Black America and apologize for what he did. But Black people not even aware he should apologize because of the fact that they're making these claims themselves. They're not this African American appellation. Pure nonsense. You're not African anything. You haven't been there. You don't have any language reference point. Nowhere in Africa. So how are you an African anything when your whole basis of existence comes out of your family and your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth? If I ask you where your roots are, you'll tell me that your parents were born in, let's say, Flint. And I'll say, well, where are your grandparents born? You tell me they're born in North Carolina or Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina or Virginia. What about your great-grandparents? As I go back further and further and further, you'll say at some point, I don't know. because you don't know what country they came from. There's a blending of the identity when they get here. But you know that there's that they were from the South, and they came here during the migratory periods that we had in this country, 1890, 1920, those times. Some of you came in, some 1960. I came here myself in 1966. But this idea you're going to trace your roots back, which Gates is doing that now, and all of that. Look, all this is people that are playing with games with your identity. You're not able to go back. You can never go back home again. You are home. And we might as well get that out of our mind. You can go back there and visit, because originally that's the place where blacks originated from that land space. But if you're trying to go back to a village as if your people are waiting for you to return, which is what Alex Haley did in 1976 when he finished his book called Roots, you can forget that. That's another form of an appropriation and blasphemy, because you can't go back to a village. That village doesn't even exist anymore. And I'm going to take them over there to let them see that. Let them see that what Alex Haley claimed in that book called Roots, all that is fiction. The whole book is fiction. And that man tried to pass that stuff off as history. So that's usurpation by Barack Obama. And I find that to be unforgivable. I don't forgive Obama for that. And I expect him, if he wants to be forgiven, I expect Obama to do exactly what Elizabeth Warren did. I expect you, Barack Obama, to apologize to black people in this country. And they don't even think you need to apologize, because they're just as confused as Barack Obama is. Because blacks don't understand this point. They don't understand why Pan-Africanism is not born in Africa, but born outside of Africa. All of the Pan-African movements were born outside of Africa. None of it was born in Africa, because in Africa, they could see the trees, wherein outside of Africa, all you see is a forest. You see the whole landscape. So you then say that it's just one Africa. But inside of Africa, you see the diversity in Africa. And so they're looking at it as an ethnic unit. And that's why on page 98, I was telling you about this reference point earlier, that's why in Alan Missouri's book, it's not on page 98, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll eat the book, not just the page. I'll eat the whole book. Bring it here up. I put salt and pepper on it. On page 98 of that book, softback version, it's called the African Identity. And he says, let's see, on what paragraph would that be? First paragraph. Yep, first paragraph. Where he says, and it's almost a direct quote, one of the ironies of colonialism is that it took colonialism to tell the Africans that they were Africans. That's one of the ironies of it. And what he's saying here is that until there was the colonial period, they did not see themselves as African, continental people, as we're seeing it over here. They saw themselves as Igbo, Ashanti, Dinky Irie, the Jufere, which Alex Haley said he came in contact with them when he wrote his book. The Jufere has not existed as a group for 200 years. So that was a lie by Alex Haley. And that which he didn't lie about, he stole the rest of it from other writers that he stole and lifted some of their works out, and that's why Alex had to pay them for it, like Harold Colander, that wrote a book called The Africans. And he lifted whole pages out of that book and put in his book. He also stole from, if you know the sources, he also stole from 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup's book, which you saw that in the movie. They finally put that on the big screen. It was made before by this great Renaissance man, Gordon Parks. but he made a small version of it, and then it was enlarged by a person that made the film, did a better job of it. It didn't deserve any kudos, but because they're trying now to give black people some makeup, some compensation for past discrepancies, they gave this person all kinds of awards for a film that wasn't the best film that year, but because of the way we do business in this country right now, being politically correct, they gave him some of the awards that were not deserved, but understanding they came out of a historical milieu, and they therefore gave him all these credits. But it was okay, but at least it put on the screen Solomon Northrop's story. Solomon Northrop was the fiddler in Alice Hitler's Roots. The fiddler, I think, was played by Lou Gossett. Was that Ben Green? Was one of them. And I'm saying that if you go back and read these slave narratives, you see where Alex Hitler was plagiarizing his story from. And that's a usurpation also. And I was telling this guy this past weekend that you're telling me that, he's telling me that at least what Alex Haley did then was inspire people to go read more of their history. That's not what I saw. When they put that movie on television, that 12-part series on television, I saw people going out there beating people up. Because they were seeing it through the victimization eyes. And that was a disservice that Alex Haley did in that regard, because people thought it was all about Europeans grabbing Africans, putting them on the boat. They didn't see the black folks role in it. But go and look at the real history of it. And I hope that when they come back, they will have a different understanding of the history when they come back, because we can study all the books we want to study in the study group. But until you go see it for yourself, you will not know it. You won't know it firsthand. You can do a lot of stuff secondary, but go and see it for yourself. And when they come back, they'll be just as changed as I was when I went over there in 1984 for the first time. And I've been on that continent numerous times. And I've run into the same understandings everywhere I've gone. So Barack Obama, I'm telling you this, in case you don't know, there are people that are aware of it. You are a usurper of black people's history in this country. If you want to claim the black part of your personality, then that is in Kenya, where you have those roots. You don't have any connection to the cotton field, unless Catherine Ann Durham, your mom, can trace a connection through her heritage, through a black lineage in the United States. If she cannot do that, then there is no connection that you have to those cotton fields. You don't have any connection to Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, you name them. You're not connected to that. Your connection in terms of your black roots is to that your father in Kenya. And if you want to disavow that, that's up to you. But you're not able to come over here and connect yourself up to those cotton fields. And so when you stood on those steps, you stood there as a usurper. Okay, want to cover another topic as well. The duping of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and to think that they're still colored more than 100 years after the founding. I can understand the colored people part of it in 1909 when the NAACP was founded and incorporated in 1910. I can understand why they were called the colored people. I can also understand why they called themselves Negro at that point. Anything but black. So color was acceptable. The word Negro was acceptable. And black people at that time were trying to get the word Negro capitalized because they took that as a term that legitimately defined who black people were. And it does in terms of define them as black people in Spanish, but there's no ethnic group in Africa called Negroes, so you cannot trace that word back into the African continent because that's a Spanish word, a Spanish-Portuguese word. That word would be born out of the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, which houses Portugal on the eastern part of the Iberian Peninsula and Spain on the western part of the Iberian Peninsula. And out of that part of the European continent in the Iberian Peninsula, you have that term born there, not in Africa. So that's what they were dealing with back in 1909. But to say that you're still colored in 2019 show you the debilitating aspect of identity 109 years later after the incorporation. Because the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was incorporated in 1910. And they still colored people in terms of how they respond. 2, black issues. And as quiet as it's kept, there's still a discourse going on between the colored people and the black people, just like there are certain frictions going on between blacks and that N-word, because there's some tribal things going on in that regard also. That's what the comedian is talking about when he said that there's a war going on between blacks and that N-word, and he said the N-word, those people, they're winning, meaning that the people that's tearing stuff up, that group, and then the black folks, there's a little bit of tension between those persons. And that's true also. So identity is very complex. It's not the same in terms of the way it's looked at here and the way it's looked at on the continent of Africa. And we have to understand the identity here, and therefore we understand when it's being usurped by those who are not a part of that identity. And Barack Obama, you're not part of it. I'm sorry, you need to apologize. And those who don't know that you need to apologize, I'm demanding they apologize in your name so they'll wake you up. Because I'm already woke, W-O-K-E. And you need to wake up yourself. A lot of you are not woke. Just have your eyes open. What's that thing called? Not sleepwalking, it's another term. But walking is something about walking with your eyes wide shut. Not wide open, your eyes wide shut. Your eyes open, what you're seeing is a mirage. You're not seeing reality. The duping of the NAACP, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, I wanted that as a topic because I can remember that I came up 7 years, I finished high school 7 years after Brown. And although the Supreme Court had ruled that separate schools were inherently unequal, I don't know why that makes them inherently unequal because they're separate. They're not inherently equal. You can certainly have different finance and have different inequalities built into the structure because you don't have these instructors there as you have elsewhere. But inherent unequal means that there must be some inferiority in the operation. And so the groups, therefore, are unequal because if it's inherent, it must be inherent within the groups that are in the separate facilities. But I don't, so that's another problem to say that they were inherently unequal. The schools were unequal because they're unequally funded. And Harold Cruz, you were more correct in saying that what the court should have rendered in Plessy is plural but equal. That is, say there are all groups in the country that we have plural groups, all of them clinging together with their own groups. We have a good example up here, by the way, 20 miles from Flint. Go up to Frankenmuth and look at it. Walk in, or you go into a place where I was yesterday. I took my wife out yesterday to dinner. Went over to a restaurant. I won't call the name because they're not paying us to advertise the restaurant. I went over to one of the better restaurants in the city of Flint. And when I walked into that restaurant, I had walked into what? China. Because when you walk in there, first of all, on the outside doors, there's Chinese writing. And you walk in, there are the ornaments that are up there on the ceiling. They got the ornaments. You go to China and see the same thing. When you walk into a Chinese restaurant, and I'm trying to think about are there any exceptions to it in terms of when you walk into a Chinese restaurant. Let's see. Yeah, you over there to the one over here on London Road. You walk into that restaurant, the one that's the buffet. And when you walk in there, you don't have any doubt that you walk into a place that culturally represents China, because that's the cultural representation of that group. So every group is plural, meaning they are clinging together with their own members. And when they say Chinese restaurant, they might employ one person to kind of go to meet the customers, but basically they've employed Chinese there. I have yet to see a Japanese or another Asian that's hired in a Chinese restaurant. I have yet to see that. I'm just telling you, if you think that that's an Asian restaurant, if you don't think it's a Chinese restaurant, you think it's an Asian restaurant. Go see if there are any people in there that are from the Philippines. I mean, all groups have their own, and they have their own diversity. Now, about the duping of the NAACP and the Brown versus Board of Education case, I was surprised to find when during the 50th anniversary, I was surprised when I finally read on the 5th anniversary of Brown versus Board, I read for the first time in 2004, I finally read the transcript of the Brown case. And I found everything I thought I knew about the Brown case was wrong. This was not about the NAACP overwhelming the court with its arguments. The court had already determined to outlaw Plessy versus Ferguson. There's a lot to it. I will give you some books to go read. Go read Leon Freed's book, Brown versus Board, the landmark oral argument before the Supreme Court, and then read Richard Kluger's book called Brown versus Board of Education. Go read that book and see that the public understanding is wrong. Last point, The Mythology of Black Leadership, a book by Bonnie Allen. I'm awakened to it now, but I can remember being awakened to it by Baldwin back in the 70s. Baldwin, I asked him about black leadership, and Baldwin told me, like I was a little child, said, asked me if I was kidding. He said, there's no black leadership, and there's not. He said, but understand, I'm saying this to you and not the New York Times. I have found that to be true, and that is true today as it was then. There's no black leadership. Blacks have got to understand, each one of us got to be responsible for our own space. Okay, I'll be in Africa for the next 4 weeks. Hope we'll, in fact, stay tuned to our programming that we have already put in the can to be aired each week until I get back. Until I get back, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.